corner of Oregon, in the early years of the 20th century, a house sat quietly at the edge of a dense forest. To passers-by, it was like any other dwelling, its weathered wooden walls and sloped roof blending into the landscape of moss-draped trees and misty hills. Yet inside, an unsettling secret lingered, one that would soon ripple through the nearby settlements and become a story whispered in hushed tones. The family who lived there was unlike any other, bound not only by blood and circumstance, but by a profound, almost incomprehensible connection to the dead. Their home, at once ordinary and ghastly, held within it a quiet horror that would challenge the understanding of anyone who dared to look too closely. The family members were anonymous to outsiders, their identities obscured by the very remoteness that kept them hidden. They moved with calm precision, performing daily routines in the shadow of a practice so unnatural that it blurred the line between life and death. Visitors, should there have been any, would have noticed nothing unusual at first. Laundry hung to dry, the smoke of a wood stove curling toward the ceiling, the faint murmur of voices in conversation. Yet the air carried a subtle weight, a tension that hinted at the unseen. It was as if the house itself remembered things that the living had long forgotten. Locals first became aware of the family's secret through faint, disturbing signs. The smell of decay occasionally drifted from the home, muted but persistent, never enough to provoke immediate intervention, yet enough to stir unease. Children passing nearby spoke of strange shapes in the windows, glimpses of figures that moved in unnatural ways, shadows lingering longer than they should. A few daring adults claimed to have peered through the cracks of the wooden walls, only to see a tableau that defied explanation, forms lying on beds and chairs, seemingly at rest, yet the household moved around them with unflinching routine. It was life and death intertwined, a silent choreography of the living coexisting with the dead. The patriarch of the family, though never fully seen by outsiders, became a figure of particular fascination and dread. His movements were deliberate, measured, almost ritualistic. Every object in the house seemed to occupy a precise place, each task executed with quiet reverence. Whether he was tending the stove, chopping wood, or preparing meals, there was an invisible order that guided his actions, an awareness that he existed not merely among the living but alongside the dead. Observers would later speculate about his motivations: grief that had hardened into obsession, a psychological response to isolation, or a conviction rooted in belief and culture that death was not a final departure, but a state to be integrated into daily life. The children and other family members were similarly enmeshed in this strange coexistence. They moved seamlessly among rooms where the corpses were present, interacting with them as if they were simply part of the household, never pausing to express fear or discomfort. Their behavior was studied yet unstudied, instinctive yet intentional, revealing a learned adaptation to an environment that would have seemed unimaginable to outsiders. It was this normalization of the macabre that both fascinated and horrified those who learned of it, a practice that challenged cultural expectations and the very nature of familial bonds. As the story began to leak into the wider community, curiosity mingled with fear. Some sought rational explanations, invoking medical conditions, prolonged grief, or eccentricity amplified by isolation. Others framed the family's practices within moral or religious frameworks, speaking of transgression, unnatural devotion, or the influence of dark impulses. Regardless of interpretation, the house became a locus of unease, a site where ordinary understanding faltered and imagination took over. Each report, each whispered tale, layered tension onto the collective perception, making the family an emblem of the unknown that lurked quietly at the edges of familiar life. The physical details of the home only deepened the sense of mystery. Faded wallpaper peeled at the corners, floorboards creaked in response to weight and age, and the rooms were dimly lit, often by a single oil lamp whose flame cast long, trembling shadows. The dead were positioned in a way that suggested careful thought, not chaos. Beds were made, chairs arranged, and tables set, as though the house maintained a semblance of ordinary domesticity. It was a performance of life sustained alongside the dead, a silent testament to human adaptation and the complex interplay between grief, memory, and survival in isolation. For investigators and curious observers, the house presented a challenge. How could one confront a reality so alien yet so intimate? How could a family integrate death into daily existence with such seamlessness that it became almost invisible to those living among them? The questions were numerous, yet the answers remained elusive. Observers reported a feeling of being watched, not by the living but by the weight of accumulated presence, a psychological tension that created unease even in those unacquainted with the household. The house itself seemed alive with history, memory, and quiet insistence that the dead were as present as the living. This initial discovery was only the beginning. What followed were accounts of rituals and routines that unfolded with uncanny regularity, of the family navigating a landscape where the boundaries between life and death were porous, and of the eerie calm that accompanied such practices. Each incident was a layer of complexity, a fragment of human behavior that refused simple explanation. And as more witnesses recounted their experiences, the narrative grew, embedding itself in local lore and establishing the family's home as a symbol of the strange, the forbidden, and the profoundly unsettling. The case of this Oregon household is not one of spectacle or overt violence. Rather, it is a story of quiet horror, a reflection on human resilience, grief, and the cultural frameworks that define our understanding of death. It challenges assumptions, evokes deep unease, and invites reflection on the limits of social norms and the extraordinary ways humans adapt to the incomprehensible. In revealing the household secret, we confront not only a particular family's choices, but also broader questions about mortality, ritual, and the hidden spaces within human experience where life and death coexist in delicate, haunting balance. At the turn of the 20th century, Oregon was a land of contrasts. Its rugged forests and sweeping mountain ranges contrasted sharply with the emerging towns and settlements that dotted the valleys. Life in these areas was dictated by the seasons, by the availability of resources, and by the isolation that came with living miles from the nearest neighbor or market. Families relied heavily on self-sufficiency, growing their own food, chopping wood for warmth, and maintaining tools and homes through careful attention and routine labor. The region's remoteness fostered both resilience and a certain psychological distance, as human contact was limited and daily existence often focused on survival rather than social engagement. Communities were small and tight-knit, often composed of multiple generations living together or in close proximity. The concept of family extended beyond immediate relatives. Neighbors frequently acted as extended kin, sharing labor, resources, and responsibilities. Yet, in these frontier regions, isolation could also cultivate behaviors that diverged sharply from broader societal norms. With few outsiders to enforce conventions and limited access to formal institutions like schools, hospitals, or churches, households often developed unique practices influenced by necessity, superstition, and personal belief systems. Death was an unavoidable part of life in early 1900s Oregon. Infant mortality rates were high, disease outbreaks were common, and accidents in logging, mining, and farming claimed lives frequently. Communities had developed practical methods for handling death, but mourning was both a private and public affair. The presence of the deceased within homes, while not entirely unprecedented in frontier settings due to delays in burial or limited mortuary access, was generally temporary. Most families adhered to cultural norms emphasizing the separation of the living from the dead. To live permanently alongside corpses was considered highly irregular, even taboo, creating a psychological and moral tension that outsiders struggled to comprehend. The region's culture was heavily influenced by European American settlers who brought a mixture of religious and cultural frameworks. Protestant denominations were common, and churches served as community centers, providing moral guidance, social gatherings, and support networks. Religious interpretations of death, mourning, and family life were embedded deeply into daily routines. The idea that deceased relatives should be revered and remembered was common, yet the practice of integrating them into daily domestic life, as this particular family did, violated implicit moral and cultural boundaries. The tension between frontier pragmatism and social expectation was ever present, creating a backdrop for both fascination and fear when cases like this emerged. Economic conditions also shaped family behavior. Oregon's rural economy was primarily agricultural and resource-based, with logging, fishing, and small-scale farming forming the backbone of livelihood. Households often had to adapt to shortages of supplies, harsh winters, and labor-intensive routines that demanded cooperation and careful planning. These conditions could reinforce unusual behaviors, storing food for long periods, improvising tools, or creating domestic systems that maximized efficiency, even if they seemed eccentric to outsiders. Isolation, scarcity, and environmental pressures created fertile ground for practices that diverged from mainstream societal expectations. Education and medical infrastructure were limited. Small one-room schoolhouses dotted rural Oregon, serving multiple age groups under a single teacher. Medical care was often rudimentary, with home remedies and local healers filling gaps in professional services. Mental health understanding was particularly constrained, with psychological conditions often misattributed to moral weakness, religious failing, or eccentricity. Communities relied on observation, intuition, and social reputation to assess behavioral norms. In this context, a family integrating the dead into daily life would not only challenge moral codes but also evade meaningful intervention from medical authorities due to limited access and understanding. Frontier families often employed rituals to navigate life and death, influenced by both practical necessity and superstition. Certain customs involved the care of the deceased prior to burial, but these were generally brief and structured. The permanence of corpses within the domestic space, however, was unprecedented in most documented settings. This practice introduced both a psychological and social shock for those who became aware of it. Observers were forced to reconcile the ordinary domestic rhythms of the household with the extraordinary presence of the dead, a dissonance that heightened the aura of mystery and horror surrounding the family. Isolation also fostered distinct family dynamics. With limited external oversight, behaviors within the household could develop largely unchecked. Children learned by observation, parents enforced routines according to household rules, and the domestic sphere became an ecosystem unto itself. In such conditions, norms could diverge significantly from regional or national standards without immediate consequence. This autonomy allowed unusual practices to flourish, though it also magnified the psychological imprint of these behaviors on both family members and curious outsiders who eventually became aware of the household secret. The broader social framework of Oregon in 1903 emphasized both self-reliance and community accountability. While families were expected to manage their own affairs, neighbors, local authorities, and religious leaders maintained informal oversight, especially regarding morality, health, and public welfare. Deviations from expected norms, particularly those related to death and domestic order, would naturally attract attention, discussion, and moral judgment. The family's behavior existed in tension with these expectations, creating a liminal space where private practice collided with public scrutiny. Travel and communication in rural Oregon further shaped perceptions. Roads were often unpaved and difficult to traverse, particularly in winter months. Postal service connected settlements, but letters could take days or weeks to arrive. News spread primarily through word of mouth, local newspapers, and occasional visitors. This slow flow of information meant that extraordinary events were often sensationalized, rumors accumulated, and the mystique of isolation intensified. The family's unusual practices were thus amplified, both by the difficulty of verifying claims and by the psychological weight of remote, inaccessible locations. Finally, cultural attitudes toward death, ritual, and domestic space informed reactions to the household. While frontier pragmatism allowed for some flexibility, there remained deeply ingrained expectations about the separation of living and dead, the sanctity of domestic routines, and the moral structure of family life. The family's integration of corpses into daily existence violated these boundaries, creating a profound sense of unease. Observers, whether neighbors, clergy, or visiting authorities, faced the challenge of interpreting a reality that defied both convention and understanding. In sum, the historical and cultural context of Oregon in 1903 created the conditions for both the emergence of this extraordinary household practice and the profound reactions it elicited. Isolation, frontier pragmatism, environmental pressures, limited medical understanding, and deeply held cultural norms regarding death combined to shape a world in which a family could live alongside the dead while remaining largely undisturbed, at least until the secret became known. The intersection of survival, belief, and moral expectation formed the backdrop against which the story of this household unfolded, laying the groundwork for a narrative that would intrigue, horrify, and endure for generations. The first outsiders to glimpse the household secret did so with hesitant curiosity, arriving under the pretense of routine visits or simple errands. The air around the home was heavy, an intangible tension that pressed against the skin and lingered in the lungs. A visitor stepping through the gate would notice the ordinary trappings of a rural Oregon homestead: laundry drying on lines, smoke curling from the chimney, and the faint sounds of children moving about. Yet an undertone of something other, a subtle discord, hinted at the abnormal life that unfolded behind the wooden walls. The initial encounter was not marked by violence, but by disquiet. As one neighbor approached the front door, he caught sight of a figure lying unnaturally still in the parlor, partially covered with a thin cloth. At first, he assumed illness or rest, yet the figure did not breathe in a manner that matched the living. Children played nearby, oblivious to the presence, their laughter muffled by distance, while the adults carried on daily tasks as though nothing were amiss. The neighbor froze, struck by the dissonance between ordinary domesticity and the silent presence that did not belong. In the kitchen, the family's routine revealed a chilling ritual. Pots were stirred, bread kneaded, and meals prepared with meticulous care, all while bodies lay in adjoining rooms. The scent of cooking mingled with the faint, persistent odor of decay, a juxtaposition that defied natural expectation. Observers noted the calm, almost reverent manner in which the family navigated the home, stepping carefully around the inert forms, adjusting chairs, and folding linens as if acknowledging the presence of the deceased. There was no fear in their movements, only an eerie competence that suggested familiarity born of prolonged exposure. One evening, a child stumbled while carrying a basket of firewood, their foot catching on a rug. The basket toppled, scattering logs across the floor. A subtle sound followed, a whisper of motion from the parlor. The eldest sibling moved silently to the room, returning moments later with the fallen logs replaced and the rug perfectly aligned, as though the disruption had never occurred. The precision of these movements, the unspoken care with which the family managed minor incidents, imbued the home with a sense of ritualized order that outsiders could barely comprehend. Visitors who attempted to speak with the family often encountered an unsettling stillness. Conversations were brief, measured, and polite, yet the eyes of the household members betrayed no reaction to the presence of the dead. In some instances, a visitor would mention a body, perhaps questioning its presence, and the response was calm, almost academic, as if discussing furniture or farm equipment. There was a deliberate neutrality, a refusal to react emotionally, that heightened the psychological tension and left witnesses questioning their own perceptions. The children of the household engaged with the corpses in ways that outsiders found disturbing. They would bring water to the lips of a deceased sibling, adjust blankets, or retrieve objects that had fallen. Their actions were practical, devoid of theatrics, yet the naturalness of their behavior in the presence of death created a cognitive dissonance for anyone watching. This normalization of the macabre suggested a learned behavior, a careful inculcation by parents or guardians that death was neither to be feared nor mourned in traditional ways, but integrated into daily life. Incidents in the home occasionally escalated into physical mishaps, though still non-violent. A chair might collapse under the weight of a body, or an object displaced by a child's hand. The family responded immediately, correcting the disruption, restoring the environment to its precise configuration. The sound of snapping wood or clattering tools punctuated the otherwise quiet atmosphere, amplifying the tension in the observer's mind. Each adjustment, each subtle motion underscored the household's meticulous order, making the presence of the dead both unavoidable and strangely invisible. One of the more unsettling accounts involved the preparation of meals in proximity to the deceased. Observers reported watching a mother move about the kitchen, chopping vegetables and tending a fire, while the father adjusted a chair in the parlor where a relative lay. The seamless coordination between the living and the dead, the ability to maintain household functionality amidst such proximity, created a pervasive unease. The air seemed to thrum with quiet tension, every creak of the floorboards and flicker of lamplight amplifying the impression of life coexisting with death. Visitors who stayed longer began to notice subtler details: the faint rustle of fabric, the imperceptible rearrangement of objects, the occasional shadow shifting against walls in a manner inconsistent with human movement. A small crack in the floorboard revealed an empty cavity beneath, perhaps used for storage, Yet the family moved with such deliberate calm that curiosity never fully overcame caution. Each anomaly was both explained by routine and yet left questions unanswered, layering the atmosphere with mounting psychological tension. The most striking incidents were those that occurred when the household was alone, and outsiders glimpsed the family's private interactions with the deceased. A parent might sit beside a covered body, brushing away dust or smoothing the blankets, speaking in hushed tones to an empty room. Children sometimes mimicked these actions, carefully adjusting objects or performing domestic chores near the inert forms. The house became a theater of silent ritual, a continuous performance that was observed with neutral expression, amplifying the sense of horror through calm and deliberation rather than overt violence. On rare occasions, a visitor reported hearing whispered conversations directed at the dead, an exchange that was neither mournful nor frantic but matter-of-fact. These interactions, framed by ordinary domestic sounds, fire crackling, utensils clinking, wood creaking, produced a surreal atmosphere where life and death coexisted with unnerving normality. Observers often left with their hearts pounding, unsettled not by direct threat, but by the psychological weight of witnessing a reality so foreign, yet meticulously organized. Several minor accidents further intensified the household's eerie reputation. A candle tipped over near a corpse, threatening fire, yet was swiftly extinguished without alarm. A child's foot struck a chair, sending it clattering to the floor, yet the family's response restored order instantly, leaving no evidence of disruption. Each incident was punctuated by silence, precision, and control, reinforcing the notion that the household operated according to its own internal logic, a system that outsiders could observe but not fully comprehend. The cumulative effect of these incidents produced a persistent sense of unease in the community. Witnesses described an almost tactile tension, an atmosphere thick with anticipation, as if the house itself demanded recognition and respect for its unusual order. The presence of the dead, maintained with meticulous care, became a psychological force, influencing perception, behavior, and emotional response. The family's actions, though never overtly violent, created a silent horror that lingered in memory, amplified by the natural isolation of the rural Oregon setting. As word of the household's practices spread, accounts became more elaborate. Observers recounted moments where shadows moved inexplicably, objects seemed repositioned after being disturbed, and subtle noises suggested the presence of activity beyond the visible family members. Each retelling added layers of interpretation and imagination, blending the psychological impact of witnessing the household with the natural tendency of human beings to fill gaps in understanding with narrative. By the time formal inquiries reached the household, the family's practices had already solidified into a well-rehearsed pattern. Inspectors, ministers, and physicians all noted the same phenomena: the careful, neutral management of the dead alongside the living, the seamless domestic routines, the absence of overt emotional distress, and the uncanny precision of every movement. The house itself became a participant in these incidents, its layout, lighting, and furniture shaping behavior and perception alike. In essence, the sequence of incidents that defined the household was less a series of dramatic events than a continuous unfolding of quiet, unsettling behaviors. Each minor occurrence, the fall of a chair, the adjustment of a blanket, the shifting shadow, was part of a larger tapestry, a sustained performance of domestic life interwoven with death. The horror lay not in spectacle or violence, but in the calm, deliberate normality with which the family navigated a world that outsiders would never fully understand. News of the Oregon household quickly spread beyond the immediate community, carried by neighbors, traveling merchants, and curious visitors. In a society still deeply connected to oral tradition and local reporting, the story ignited a mixture of fear, fascination, and moral outrage. Families spoke of the house in hushed tones, sometimes whispering over fences or across dinner tables, as though speaking too loudly might summon the unseen presences within. The story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the thin line between acceptable eccentricity and behaviors perceived as socially, morally, or spiritually transgressive. Neighbors who had once respected the family's privacy began to view the household with suspicion. Some claimed they had glimpsed forms in windows that should not have been there, while others described unusual odors or sounds that emanated from the home. Even those who had little direct interaction with the family felt the weight of unease simply from proximity. A sense of psychological contagion spread through the community. Fear of the unknown, anxiety about death, and uncertainty about social norms combined to make the family both objects of curiosity and figures of dread. Local clergy were among the first to attempt interpretation through a moral and spiritual lens. Ministers and pastors visited the home, sometimes discreetly, offering prayers or guidance to the living members of the household. They observed the calm, measured routines and noted the presence of corpses integrated into domestic life. Their reports often framed the behavior in terms of sin, spiritual imbalance, or a failure to adhere to God's order. Religious reflection emphasized the danger of blurring the boundaries between life and death, warning that such actions could have repercussions not only for the household, but for the moral fabric of the community at large. Medical practitioners of the era approached the situation cautiously. With limited understanding of psychology and neurology, physicians relied on observation and anecdotal accounts. Some suggested the family suffered from prolonged grief disorder, a condition intensified by isolation and repeated exposure to death. Others speculated about more severe mental health conditions, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, early forms of what might now be recognized as psychosis, or an unusual attachment to ritualized domestic patterns. These interpretations were tentative, constrained by the limits of medical knowledge and the lack of access to consistent clinical evaluation. Still, they provided a framework for understanding, at least partially, how humans could adapt to extreme situations and normalize behaviors that seemed incomprehensible to outsiders. Newspapers picked up the story, crafting narratives that combined fact, hearsay, and editorial interpretation. Headlines emphasized the eerie and sensational aspects: a family living with corpses, children who tended the dead, and a house that operated under rules unfamiliar to conventional society. Reporters balanced curiosity with moral concern, highlighting both the abnormality of the household and the social responsibility of observers to understand and intervene. Readers were captivated by the accounts, with letters to the editor reflecting fear, fascination, and speculation about what drove such behaviors. In this way, media coverage amplified the story, ensuring that it reached far beyond the immediate community and cemented the family's place in local legend. Psychologically, the reactions of the broader population were shaped by both fear and empathy. On one hand, the presence of corpses within a domestic space triggered instinctive unease, an ancient human response to death and potential danger. On the other hand, observers recognized the family's humanity. Their care, routine, and apparent absence of malice suggested grief, resilience, or adaptive coping rather than malevolence. This tension created a unique form of horror, one rooted not in spectacle or bloodshed, but in the quiet, unsettling juxtaposition of life and death, normality and abnormality. Community meetings and informal gatherings often centered on discussion of the household. Farmers, shopkeepers, and other residents debated whether intervention was necessary, weighing moral obligation against respect for autonomy and isolation. Some advocated for closer observation or engagement by clergy or medical authorities, while others preferred caution, fearing that confrontation might escalate tensions or cause harm. This dialogue reflected the broader social frameworks of early 20th century rural Oregon, where communal norms, morality, and practical necessity were constantly negotiated. Children in neighboring homes absorbed stories of the household with a mixture of fascination and dread. They whispered to one another about shadows in windows, strange shapes in the parlor, and rituals that seemed to defy conventional understanding. These stories, passed down orally and later recorded in local archives, contributed to a folklore that blurred the lines between reality and legend. The family became emblematic of the unknown, a living lesson in caution, adaptation, and the psychological impact of extreme behaviors on both witnesses and observers. From a scientific perspective, the household's practices offered an inadvertent case study in human adaptability. Anthropologists and early psychologists noted that exposure to death, when integrated gradually and systematically, could alter perception, normalize unusual behaviors, and foster resilience or detachment. Observers documented how children learned to navigate domestic spaces populated by the deceased without trauma, how adults maintained order and routine, and how the physical environment of the home facilitated these adaptations. While contemporaneous knowledge could not fully explain the household's practices, these accounts later contributed to understanding human responses to extreme isolation and prolonged grief. Local authorities were cautious in their involvement. Law enforcement and social services were minimal, and intervention was typically limited to cases of overt danger or neglect. Because the family's actions caused no immediate physical harm, and because the household was largely self-sufficient and orderly, formal intervention was rare. Instead, the household became a point of observation, a subject of social scrutiny that relied on moral judgment, communal reputation, and the psychological tension experienced by those who encountered the family indirectly. Over time, the reactions of the community formed a complex social narrative. Fear coexisted with curiosity, judgment intermingled with empathy, and fascination was tempered by moral contemplation. The household was both a site of horror and a mirror reflecting societal norms, cultural expectations, and psychological responses to death and deviance. Observers found themselves challenged to reconcile the family's calm, measured existence with their own assumptions about grief, mortality, and acceptable behavior. Even years after the initial reports, the legacy of the household persisted. Neighbors recounted tales of children who grew up knowing the dead as companions, parents who performed rituals that seemed alien yet perfectly logical within their domestic system, and a home that maintained order amidst an unsettling reality. The story became part of the cultural memory, shaping local perceptions of morality, mental health, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior in isolated frontier communities. Ultimately, the reactions of the community highlight the tension between human curiosity and the limits of comprehension. The household's calm coexistence with death forced observers to confront uncomfortable questions. How do we define normalcy? How do humans adapt to extreme circumstances? And how do societal and cultural norms intersect with individual experience to shape perception and response? In examining these reactions, one can trace not only the contours of horror, but also the psychological and cultural frameworks through which early 20th century Oregonians interpreted behaviors that defied conventional understanding. The tension that had quietly hovered over the household for years finally reached a breaking point one late autumn evening. Outside, the wind whipped through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, while inside, the house remained unnervingly still. Shadows from the flickering lamplight stretched across the walls, twisting ordinary objects into grotesque shapes. The family moved about their tasks with the same precision as always, yet the atmosphere held a palpable charge, as if the home itself was bracing for a disruption that none could yet define. It began with a minor accident. A child tripped over a rug near the parlor where the corpses were laid out. The sound of the stumble echoed unnaturally through the rooms, magnified by the hushed quiet. The family reacted immediately, moving with synchronized calm to restore order. Yet this minor disturbance seemed to awaken a subtle tension, something intangible in the air that made the shadows longer, the silence heavier. Observers, peering cautiously from a safe distance, reported an almost cinematic unfolding, where every small movement took on significance far beyond its apparent weight. As night deepened, the lamplight flickered, casting the room into brief moments of darkness. During these seconds, the observer's imagination filled the space with motion and sound, the normal creaks of the floor becoming sinister, the faint shifting of fabric appearing deliberate. The family continued their routines, brushing dust from blankets, adjusting chairs, and preparing meals, all while the unseen presence of death lingered in the same rooms. Each action was measured, precise, and unnervingly neutral, as though acknowledging the dead was a matter of practicality rather than emotion. The first true escalation came when a candle on the dining table sputtered, threatening to topple. A sudden gust from the slightly open window caused the flame to flicker violently, illuminating the parlor where a body lay on the floor. For a heartbeat, the scene resembled a tableau of life and death frozen in motion, the child frozen mid-step, the body undisturbed, and the lamp's flame casting dancing shadows across the walls. The father moved first, stepping carefully to steady the candle, his movements deliberate and calm, restoring the environment without a word. Yet the psychological impact on any witness was profound. The room seemed to breathe with an unnatural rhythm, and the boundaries between the living and the dead felt impossibly thin. The household's pets, small dogs and cats accustomed to the eerie routines, began to react. Low growls and soft hisses filled the corners, their instinctive unease amplifying the tension. A child approached one of the corpses to adjust its position, and the pet recoiled sharply. Its reaction a subtle confirmation that something about the environment remained outside the ordinary realm of domesticity. The family, however, remained unflinching, continuing their coordinated actions with uncanny calm, as though the unseen disruptions were part of a rehearsed ritual. A particularly tense moment unfolded when the eldest sibling accidentally knocked a small stool against a table, sending it clattering to the floor. The sound reverberated through the rooms like a gunshot in the silence. The mother's hands paused mid-task, the candlelight casting an elongated shadow across her face. The child froze, eyes wide, and for a fleeting moment the room was suspended in a tableau of shared tension. Then, almost imperceptibly, the mother and sibling resumed their duties, restoring the stool and table to precise alignment, the disruption erased as though it had never occurred. The observer's heart pounded in response, their sense of normal time and motion warped by the household's seamless recovery. The climax escalated further as an unexpected visitor arrived at the door. Having ignored the rising warnings and rumors, the family's reaction was subtle but charged. A quiet adjustment of seating, a slight shift in posture, the faint repositioning of a body's blanket. The visitor's presence introduced an unpredictable element, creating a heightened state of tension that reverberated through the house. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of fabric, every flicker of lamplight became amplified. The observer, now included in the dramatic tableau, felt the oppressive weight of the household's unspoken rules and the invisible authority of its routines. Suddenly, a body that had been resting in the corner shifted slightly, prompted not by any living hand, but by the subtle settling of the floor and furniture. The combination of movement, shadow, and lamplight created a momentary illusion of animation. The visitor gasped, and for a heartbeat, the room seemed alive with spectral presence. The family, undeterred, continued as if nothing unusual had occurred. The tension was so thick that it could almost be touched, a silent testimony to the strange coexistence of life and death within these walls. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows and adding an auditory layer of horror to the scene. The observer noted the way the house seemed to resist chaos, how every object was realigned, every movement controlled, and how the family's routines created a form of calm authority in the midst of psychological terror. Even the pets, momentarily startled by the illusions, returned to their quiet vigilance, confirming the home's eerie equilibrium. As the evening continued, the family performed tasks that observers later described as ritualistic. Chairs were adjusted, blankets smoothed, a fire stoked, food prepared and placed on the table, all while the bodies lay interspersed throughout the rooms. The surreal balance between life and death, order and disturbance, created a tension that was almost unbearable to any outsider. Time seemed to stretch, each second elongated by the uncertainty of what was real and what was imagined. The most dramatic incident of the night involved the unintentional knocking over of a small lamp near the staircase. Its flame extinguished, plunging part of the house into darkness. The family, undeterred, moved with absolute calm, relighting candles and oil lamps, restoring both light and order with meticulous precision. The observer described the sensation as standing in a world where ordinary laws of cause and effect were suspended, where psychological and environmental stimuli combined to create an unparalleled atmosphere of suspense and dread. By the time the night ended, the visitor left profoundly altered, haunted not by overt violence, but by the subtle, pervasive control of the household over its environment and the living and dead within it. The climax of the evening was not a single event, but a culmination of layered incidents, each amplifying the uncanny, each demonstrating the household's mastery over a reality that defied conventional understanding. The night closed with the family settling into a rhythm of quiet domesticity, bodies positioned, furniture aligned, meals prepared, and the home restored to its equilibrium. The observer, and indeed the wider community, would later reflect on this night as the apex of the family's unnerving presence, a peak of tension and psychological horror that exemplified the quiet, meticulous and disciplined integration of life and death. The house itself seemed to exhale, the wind outside subsiding, leaving behind a lingering sense of awe, unease, and contemplative fear. The climax illustrated the core of the household's existence, not the shock of sudden events, but the sustained, unnerving mastery over their environment, a quiet horror that relied on precision, repetition, and the uncanny normalization of death. Observers were left questioning the boundaries of human behavior, the nature of grief, and the extraordinary ways in which humans can adapt to circumstances that challenge conventional understanding. The tension, once experienced, lingered long after the visitor departed, a silent testament to the psychological and cultural power of the household's practices. In the years following the revelation of the Oregon household's extraordinary practices, the story settled into the quiet rhythms of memory and speculation. The family itself, shrouded in anonymity, receded from public view, their daily routines continuing behind the walls of the weathered home, largely untouched by direct intervention. Yet the impact of their actions lingered far beyond the immediate frontier, rippling through the consciousness of the community and embedding itself in regional folklore. The house, once a locus of fear and curiosity, became emblematic of the thin line separating life from death, the ordinary from the uncanny, and the psychological from the moral. The immediate aftermath for the family was subtle, yet profound. Living in isolation, with the dead integrated into daily life, had cultivated an extraordinary resilience. Children who grew up in this environment adapted to the presence of corpses with a calm competence that outsiders found disturbing. Adults maintained routines that reinforced order and control, demonstrating a psychological equilibrium forged under extreme conditions. To any observer, the family appeared composed, functional, and unwavering, a living testament to human adaptability in the face of extraordinary circumstances. Community responses continued to evolve. Neighbors, initially frightened and judgmental, came to accept the family as a peculiar fixture of local life. Conversations shifted from moral outrage to cautious curiosity. Some visitors attempted to rationalize the household's practices, invoking psychological theories, grief responses, or practical constraints of frontier life. Others framed it within folklore and superstition, interpreting the home as a space where natural and spiritual boundaries overlapped. The household became a reference point for understanding eccentricity, grief, and human adaptability, a cautionary tale that simultaneously fascinated and unsettled those who encountered it. Medical speculation remained persistent. While early 20th century physicians could offer little definitive explanation, modern interpretations suggest the family may have exhibited behaviors aligned with prolonged grief, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, or ritualized coping mechanisms in response to isolation and frequent exposure to death. Psychologists today might describe it as a combination of adaptive strategy and culturally influenced practice, demonstrating how environmental stressors, social isolation, and familial cohesion can produce behaviors that challenge conventional norms without necessarily indicating pathology. These interpretations, while grounded in science, cannot fully capture the lived experience of the household, leaving an enduring element of mystery. The house itself became a silent character in the narrative. Its structure, rooms, and furnishings were meticulously maintained, reflecting the household's emphasis on order and routine. Shadows cast by lamplight, the creaking of floorboards, and the subtle realignment of objects over time created an environment where perception and reality intertwined. Observers described feeling the weight of history in every corner, a presence that seemed to watch and guide, reinforcing the household's unique equilibrium. In this way, the physical space contributed as much to the haunting atmosphere as the family's actions, blurring boundaries between architecture, psychology, and ritual. Stories passed down through neighbors, descendants, and local chroniclers often emphasized ambiguity. Did the family continue their practices unchanged, or did the passage of time introduce transformation? Were all members equally complicit, or did some harbor private doubts and fears? Such questions were never definitively answered, creating a narrative space where imagination, memory, and speculation coexisted. The household, both real and symbolic, occupied a liminal space in local history, one where certainty was elusive and mystery endured. The social and psychological impact on the broader community remained significant. Observers reported lingering unease, a heightened awareness of mortality, and a deeper curiosity about human adaptability under extreme conditions. Discussions in households, churches, and public spaces frequently return to the Oregon family as a touchstone for exploring morality, grief, and the human response to death. The story provided an enduring lesson in the complexities of human behavior, reminding communities that what is unfamiliar or unsettling may not always be malevolent, but can illuminate the extraordinary range of human experience. In reflective accounts written decades later, the family's practices were framed both as an extreme adaptation to frontier conditions and as a cultural artifact revealing the interplay between isolation, grief, and resilience. Scholars, folklorists, and psychologists alike noted the importance of understanding context, the environmental pressures of rural Oregon, the scarcity of resources, the limited access to formal medical and social institutions, and the pervasive presence of death in everyday life. Within this context, the family's behavior, while shocking, emerged as a logical extension of survival, memory, and ritualized coping mechanisms. Speculation endures regarding the ultimate fate of the household. Did descendants continue the practices, integrating the dead into daily life with the same disciplined precision? Did the family eventually conform to broader societal norms, abandoning the rituals that defined their early years? Or did the household dissolve into history, leaving behind only fragments of observation, rumor, and folklore? No definitive answers exist, ensuring that the story retains a haunting resonance that transcends time and place. Perhaps most unsettling is the psychological lesson left for those who learn of the household. The calm coexistence of life and death, the meticulous order maintained amidst circumstances that outsiders would deem horrific, challenges assumptions about fear, morality, and the boundaries of human adaptation. It forces reflection on the ways grief can manifest, the resilience of familial bonds under extreme stress, and the capacity for humans to normalize conditions that would otherwise provoke horror. The mystery is not only in the physical actions of the family, but in the psychological implications, the ways in which environment, culture, and necessity shape perception and behavior. Ultimately, the Oregon household stands as a testament to the intersection of history, culture, and human psychology. Its legacy is not a story of violence, but of profound adaptation, quiet horror, and enduring mystery. It reminds us that human behavior can stretch the boundaries of comprehension, that life and death can coexist under extraordinary circumstances, and that the stories we inherit from history are often as haunting in their subtlety as they are in their spectacle. The house, the family, and the silent rituals within remain etched in collective memory, a shadowed reflection of the extraordinary complexities of human life, death, and the spaces in between. Even today, the story invites reflection. It compels us to ask how far human resilience can extend, how cultural and environmental pressures shape behavior, and what it means to witness something that defies conventional understanding. In the end, the family that lived with corpses remains both a historical curiosity and a psychological enigma, a haunting testament to the fragile, adaptable, and often mysterious nature of human existence.